Oh, a couple of years, maybe, or more than that.
No longer.
I haven't been keeping track, sorry. Yeah,
I just looked up, I had to remind myself what enchanted means, because words like that, you know, we have sort of a vague recollection, maybe some people do, but the actual dictionary definition, bewitched,
oh,
an enchanted garden, for example, or charmed in some way. And I think both of those things, I think, do apply to the Galapagos Islands. So as Peter mentioned, I sort of had a parallel career with my research scientist position at the Canadian Wildlife Service here in Sackville. I worked in Newfoundland as well for quite a while, and before that at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. Back in the 90s, I had a call to the office from a company that was in Newfoundland, from a company who was looking at taking actually the old Northern Ranger. I don't know whether you've ever been on her before. She used to do the Lewisport to Goose Bay, Happy Valley Goose Bay run. And the concept was to take her off that run in the wintertime and, believe it or not, send it to Antarctica.
mm.
And it wasn't the best vessel, I can tell you right now, to be in open ocean, but she did survive, and that was my first introduction to cruising in, like I said, 1992, and I've been doing it ever since as a sort of a parallel career, and I still do it. These days I go to the Great Lakes with Viking. They've got a couple of ships in the Great Lakes. It's expedition cruising, so it's education, it's immersion in where you are in everything from history, culture, nature, etc. And I really enjoy it. So still do that. Keeps me going. And that's what got me, even the first time I went to the Galapagos in 2006. It was through a connection with cruising that I got down there. And then I've been 3 times since then, during and after COVID, as it turns out, working down there because the company I worked for at the time still has a ship down there. And I'll talk a little bit about that, what it means to have a ship in the Galapagos and what have you. So here we go. And maybe we can...
Yes.
We don't have to be really dark, but
I like it really
that
dark.
just gives people just used to seeing.
We've got controls over here and other places.
Yeah, just a little bit of light off the screen. That's perfect. Yeah.
Enough dark?
Perfect. Is that okay, everybody?
Oh, yeah.
So, Galapagos. That's the way you say it. It's not Galapagos or anything. It's a Spanish word. It's an old Spanish word, Galapagos. And you can see I had it correct in the title. You see there is an accent. And if you know anything about Spanish, you know that if the accent doesn't fall naturally in a word, then they will mark the accent, which syllable gets the accent. So Galapagos rather than Galapagos or something like that. Galapagos. So what does Galapagos mean? Well, it actually refers to tortoises, giant tortoises. And the actual word means a saddle. It's an old Spanish word for saddle. And you can see I picked one of these particular subspecies of the Galapagos giant tortoise that has the flared shell up front. And that allows it in certain islands where it needs to reach up. Through evolutionary time, the shell has actually flared up around the necks to allowing the animal to reach high up into the trees to eat vegetation. And so you can imagine sort of sitting on that thing a little bit, and maybe the Spanish it reminded them of a saddle, and that's why the Galapagos in a roundabout way gets its name. Yes, so it's on the equator, and the Galapagos Islands are part of Ecuador, and Ecuador, believe it or not, means equator in Spanish. So the country name is Equator in Spanish. And it is literally right on the equator. You can just see this group of islands right here, and this ridge here, the Carnegie Ridge, underwater, and it's right on the equator, as you can see here. Some of the islands, the majority of the landmass is to the south in the southern hemisphere, and a few of the islands, the northern tip of Isabella and these 4 islands here, are in the northern hemisphere. And you can see the distance. They're really remote. And that's one of the secrets of the Galapagos, remoteness. They're 1,100 kilometers, 600 nautical miles from the nearest center of biodiversity. They're volcanic islands, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute in terms of what that means, in terms of the development of the Galapagos. So you can't really read that, and that's exactly what you shouldn't say in any presentation, but I can help you out. Because this is an old map, just to say that all the islands used to have different names. The English, for example, named the islands in English. The Spanish kept the Spanish names, of course, but the English named it. So, for example, here, Isla Fernandina is actually, the English called it Narborough. And then you have Indefatigable, which is Isla Santa Cruz. And then Albemarle, Isla Isabella. So they had different names, but today none of the English names are used for the islands. The islands were first sighted by a bishop who was sailing. He was bishop from Panama, and his name was Tomás de Berlanga. And I'm not very good at history. That's why I'm looking at my notes here. I don't need to look at my notes when it comes to birds, but I do for history. And he arrived here on the 10th of March in 1535. And there's no evidence of any native people from the Pacific setting up home in the Galapagos. I can imagine, and I've quizzed people down there, Galapagos, who live and were born in the Galapagos, you know. Has anybody ever found any artifacts or anything? Because, you know, you all know, I think, stories about how maybe Polynesians got from the South Pacific to South America and vice versa, and that sort of cross-pollination. It's hard to believe that somebody didn't make it to the islands, but nobody set up home in the sense of a lasting habitation. One of the big problems is water. They're remote volcanic islands, and there's no fresh water supply, basically, or very little. They were annexed by, nobody really wanted the islands. They were out in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't really anything of value there. Like I said, there was no water, so the vegetation is very sparse out there. But they were annexed eventually in 1832 by Ecuador, and they've been part of the country of Ecuador ever since. So, how do you then connect up this beautiful little lichen to the whole story? This lichen is called Rochella gracilis, and it grows everywhere on Palo Santo trees. You may have heard of Palo Santo. It's a very interesting smell to the sap in the wood, and they burn it in churches and things like that. It's actually a very common smell in Quito, the capital of Ecuador. That you smell it all over the streets, burning, coming out of the churches, and various people burning. So this lichen grows on pretty well all the vegetation there. The interesting thing about this lichen, and they discovered it quite early on, is that if you process it in a certain way, you can extract or produce purple dye. And purple dye back then was super popular, expensive, like blue dye was as well. Blue was like a pinnacle in terms of a color that people wanted, but it was very expensive to make. You've heard of woad and various ways of making blue dye. Well, this made a purple dye, and of course purple was associated with royalty. It was an important dye in the Roman Catholic Church and that sort of thing. So one story is, I've been told by Ecuadorians, is that Ecuador actually annexed the islands because they thought there was some money in this lichen for purple dye. And they did set up a company to extract it, but it didn't really go anywhere. So here is the sort of the bathymetry and sort of the altitude, whatever you want to call that. There is a name for it, showing the mountains and the bathymetry of the ocean in this area. We have the Galapagos here. I mentioned this Carnegie Ridge. You've got South America, Ecuador, outlined in black on the right-hand side there. You've got Panama, Central America, etc. And it's a very active volcanic zone, plate tectonic zone. You've got two important plates in this area, the Cocos Plate and this Nazca Plate. The Nazca Plate is moving eastwards, and it is basically pushing up against South America. It what's called subducts, so it goes underneath the South American plate like this and forms all the volcanoes that are along the Andes Mountains, some very famous ones, all the way down the Andes mountain chain. So this is a super important plate. So the Galapagos Islands live on this plate. And you can see the red spot there. That is a hot spot. There's a hot spot underneath Iceland, for example. And I'm not going to get into the details of what it is, but basically it's a plume of hot magma that comes from very, very deep in the earth and eventually makes it to the surface and essentially burns a hole in the crust. And over top of the hot spot, you will get a volcano. The interesting thing, though, is because this plate is moving to the east, the hot spot isn't moving. So the plate moves over the hot spot. And this is happening in Hawaii as well. It's moving over the hot spot. And in fact, the Galapagos, this ridge here that's now underwater, the Carnegie Ridge, those were islands once upon a time. And they were much farther out in the Pacific Ocean. What we see now as the Galapagos Islands is only the last 5 million years. What happens generally is that when you get a volcanic island or a volcano erupting underneath the ocean, it eventually makes it to the surface. As soon as it makes it to the surface, the ocean starts to erode it, and it's generally very friable. It's ashy. There's lava and magma there, of course, lava, but still it's very friable, and it eventually wears away. So this Carnegie Ridge is worn away volcanoes from an earlier time. And I often like to think about this, that we think about 5 million years for the Galapagos Islands, but in fact there were islands there a lot earlier than that, probably with life on them. We're just getting this snapshot now of the islands that happen to be above the surface of the ocean now, or at least over the last 5 million years when we've been able to study them. That makes sense, does it? Hotspots. So there's hotspot in Iceland, causing the same situation there in Iceland. So here you see the hotspot, and you see a map of the Galapagos Islands themselves. There are the northern islands. The equator is right here. The northern islands here. The two up there, Darwin and Wolf, they're never visited. They're part of the national park, but they're not visited. They're out of bounds. I'd love to get there, by the way. And these some of these islands, like Genovesa, is visited, and the main visitation occurs in these bigger islands to the south here. But the hot spot is right here, and again the plate is moving this way. So these are the older islands, still above the surface of the water, and these are the younger islands. These are 5 million years old. These could be 700,000. Not that old at all. They're a lot taller here. These are a lot higher peaks here, these volcanoes. These are very eroded and flattish islands, the ones in the east. This is a great island here. It looks like a seahorse, eh? Each one of these is a volcano. And there's a separate subspecies of giant tortoise that lives on each one of the volcanoes. And it's geographically isolated from the other volcanoes because it has to go down from the wetter areas up higher up in the volcano. It would have to go down into this dry desert-like climate that it doesn't like, so they never do. So they stay on these essentially islands, separated not by water but by a different habitat. Another thing that makes the Galapagos really interesting is the oceanography in the area. Now, you've heard about the Humboldt Current, I'm sure, the Peruvian Current or the Humboldt Current. This is this cold water current that runs up the west coast of South America, brings essentially Antarctic water north, feeds a huge fisheries for anchovies, various species of fish, millions of seabirds feeding on these anchovies and other species in this area. Copepods, our phalaropes, for example, that come up here to the Bay of Fundy, Briar Island, that sort of thing. I worked on them 20 years ago. They actually go down here and feed on the copepods in this highly productive water. But when you get up to the Galapagos, you can see that there's lots of different currents happening. There's a current coming from the west, the Cromwell Current, and then there's the Panama Current coming south. It's a warm water current. So you've got all this convergence of currents, which allows for mixing of the water and upwelling of the water. Here you see a current, the cold equatorial undercurrent coming along, hitting the Galapagos Islands and upwelling, bringing all those nutrients to the surface, bringing cold water to the surface. So the Galapagos Islands, even though it's on the equator, typically if you've been to the tropics, you'll know that water temperatures are in the region of 27, 28, 29 degrees Celsius. Here you're lucky if it's 21. On an El Nino, it might get up to 24. On a La Nina, it would be even colder than that. So it runs around 20, 21 degrees, which for tropical equatorial water is pretty cool. But that makes it great for wildlife. Very productive. And I did mention El Nino and La Nina, and you could do a whole lecture on that, of course. But it's essentially, everybody's heard about it, right? And it's too detailed, and I don't really understand fully the oceanography of it. I know a little bit about it. But essentially, it's an alternating cold water, warm water system that, the system is usually always in one state or another. Now we're in a La Nina, we were in an El Nino. Occasionally we are in between, but normally we're in one state or another. And in the El Nino situation, you have this warm water, surface water, that stretches right from the west to the east, touching the South American continent. So it affects this cold water that should be at the surface in the Galapagos and stops the upwellings, and the seabirds don't like it at all. The land birds love it though, because when you have an El Nino, it rains in the Galapagos. Warm surface water, you get lots of rain. The reverse, the La Nina, which we're in now, is where you have this cold water anomaly, where you had the warm water anomaly with the El Nino, and that's the reverse. The seabirds love that, cold water, upwelling, lots of fish, lots of food, and the land birds don't like it because it gets dry as heck, it doesn't rain, nothing flowers, so there's no seeds to eat, etc. So the islands are going back and forth between these two states constantly. Wanted to talk a little bit about getting there, just logistics. I don't just want to show you pictures of nice birds and other wildlife. Who has been? I know it's dark, but anybody been? Okay, one person behind there has been. So you know how to get there. There's lots of ways to get there. You can go through Miami. The way I got there almost every time, the first time I did go through Miami, but the last 3 trips, I've just taken Air Canada down to Houston from Toronto, and then a direct flight from Houston to Quito. Very easy. And you arrive in Quito. Quito is about 3,000 meters, so you really feel it for the first day or so, the altitude. Especially when you're talking, you feel like you have to take a breath every now and then just because you forget that you're at that altitude. But it's a wonderful city. This is the one of the main plazas in the city. It's an Inca plaza with all those stones there. So you spend some time there, and then it's very easy to take a flight. All the flights with LATAM or whatever fly from Quito to Guayaquil, and then Guayaquil directly across to Baltra, which is the airport there. It's an old U.S. Air Force base on that particular island there. And you arrive at the airport, and it's very modern these days. They pride themselves on being very eco-friendly. There's no air conditioning. It's open air, so you've got lots of breezes, and it's a very nice airport to arrive in. Very, very strict, the Galapagos is. So your port of entry, this port of entry is the way they control everything that happens in the Galapagos. This is where you pay your fee. This is where you enter the national park, which is the Galapagos Islands. It's also a marine park as well, but the land-based portion is a national park, Ecuadorian national park. And you're walking, the adventure begins right in the airport. You're walking to the terminal, and there's a land iguana right there underneath an opuntia cactus. Or the endemic Galapagos dove nesting right there in opuntia, right near the building. So it's crazy. And I hope this video works. Let's see. And you even got Darwin's finches inside the airport feeding on your snacks. These are medium ground finches, but I won't. We'll get into the Darwin's finches at the end.
So you have to protect your food.
You do, yeah. So it's been quite popular over the years. Or maybe I should put it another way. Ecuador's got a lot of bad press over the years, and I think undeservedly. There's been reports historically of them trying to promote emigration from the mainland to the Galapagos, trying to get more Ecuadorians over there for nationalistic purposes and whatever. But actually, I think the truth be told, Ecuador's done a fantastic job at conserving the Galapagos. They recognize, it's a pot of gold for Ecuador, if you think about it. Every person going there pays $100 US ticket to enter the national park, and you cannot work in the tourism industry in the Galapagos without being a Galapagueño, which is somebody who comes from the Galapagos Islands. Ecuadorians can do it, but it's tricky, and they often are told you don't have a job anymore. We found a Galapagueño who can do your job. So it's a bit tricky. There's many ways they manage visitation to make it sustainable. There's a huge demand to visit the Galapagos. And if they just left it on its own, it would be a disaster. There'd be high rises, there'd be, little condos and villas and you name it. And there isn't that sort of development at all. In all this area, and you can see it's quite a big, this is 100 kilometers, so it's a pretty big area. There's only 60 places that the Ecuadorian government allows people to land, actually on the land. If you take, for example, Isla Isabela, there are very few places you can land on that island at all. Same with Fernandina, a couple of places. more popular here, a few more landings here, but just 60 in total. And those 60 places are super well managed. You have to be guided. There's no wandering. You have to be in a group. So it's not for everybody. If you want to go there and just be free and do whatever you like, don't go to the Galapagos Islands. It's regimented, and it has to be. It has proven to be successful in the sustainability of the tourism there, which is quite an old. It's quite an old economy or development in the Galapagos. People have been going there for a long, long time. So, if you wanted to go, how do you go? You know how to fly there, of course, but there's basically two ways. You can go and join a vessel, and this is actually the vessel that I worked on for 3 trips, 2022 and 23. Lovely little vessel, a Santa Cruz Dos, and great, very comfortable, perfect. It's owned by a company. It's owned by the company I worked for, but also by an Ecuadorian company, and they've been in the Galapagos for over 50 years. These ships never leave the Galapagos, so the ships in the Galapagos never leave the Galapagos. They never touch land when they're in the Galapagos for fear of bringing rats and mice and all sorts of nasty things to all these amazing places. So the ships never touch land. Everything is done by what's called panga, which is basically a rubber boat like a Zodiac in terms of landing. So you can go by ship. So you go to Baltra, the ships are right there, you join the ship in Baltra after your flight, or you can fly to one of the 2 towns in the islands, and there are towns. I mean, this could be any main street in Central America or South America for that matter. Many places in the Caribbean as well could look like this, but this is actually in Puerto Ayora, and it's actually from 2006, so it probably doesn't look quite that way anymore, but you can see it's just a normal town. You can go there, you can stay in a hotel, you can do day trips to certain places. You won't get out to see everything doing it that way, but it's another way to do it, sort of more self-driven in that sense. Okay, so Darwin was mentioned, and he's my hero. And when you're there and you look across the islands and you know he was there because he wrote about it, it's a real sense of being in his footsteps. It's a really interesting, emotional thing. For me it was anyway. But a lot of the influence of the Galapagos Islands on Darwin has been overblown, I think, and I think the literature supports that. He made a long journey around the world, taking 5 years, more or less. He spent 5 weeks in the Galapagos. The influence, arguably, I think, again, the literature suggests that arguably South America itself had the most influence on him, particularly finding the fossil giant sloths and Megatherium, I think it is, and those sorts of animals. Really did make a big impression on him. And he was able to leave the ship a few times and go overland to various places and really do what he wanted to do most. And he hated the ship, of course, because he was terribly seasick and he wanted to be on land as much as possible. So a little overblown. But nevertheless, it is an important part of the Darwin story, the Galapagos are. He understood the mockingbirds. He pretty well got the mockingbirds. He got the tortoises. In fact, he ate tortoises in most of the islands. He did understand the differences between the tortoises on the different islands. He completely did not understand the finches that now have his name, the Darwin's finches. And it took a guy at the British Museum called Gould. You may have heard of Gould, very famous. Gouldian finches being one of the most colorful birds in the world. It took him to actually figure out all the samples that Darwin actually collected of Darwin's finches to figure out kind of the early days of what was going on. Since then, the Darwin's finches have become a huge study species, and there's a long-term, it still goes even though the original people don't work on, they've retired basically. But there's an amazing long-term study on Darwin's finches that continues to this day. Peter Grant is the guy who did that study with his wife Rosemary, and you highly recommend to read those books, The Beak of the Finch being one of his most famous ones. So he essentially measured evolution. He observed evolution in the making with Darwin's finches. Yes, it's fantastic for wildlife, but the scenics are amazing there too. Just the mangroves and the beautiful volcanoes, and you can see the Palo Santo trees, these bare trees. They do have leaves when it rains, but they can sit dormant for years. I was there, the times I've been there, it's been basically dry. I've never seen it wet and green. This is one of the most famous views of Bartolome Island. And you can see all these volcanoes, and you can imagine Darwin actually looking across at this scene. And it would have been quite different. I know this particular lava flow right here, this dark area in the distance, that hadn't occurred when he was there. So it would have looked a bit different when he saw this area. You can see the Palo Santo again, the lava, this lava, and these ash cones.
What's the bird flying from right to left?
Yeah, good question.
Bird of paradise?
No, it's a frigate bird. You can actually see the forked tail. Opuntia cactus this is an endemic species there, and I won't say that too often. Basically, almost everything I will show you is endemic to the Galapagos Islands. So rather than saying endemic, but this is an endemic Opuntia, and it grows in the form of trees. So it actually grows tree-like, maybe 3 or 4 meters high. Just an incredible plant, and well used by all sorts of different wildlife, including the land iguana. These are the Palo Santo themselves when the sun catches them as it's setting. It's a beautiful scene, I think. Love those trees. So lava, up close. Different types of lava, but basically they fall into 2 categories. And they're both Hawaiian words, actually. This one is the pohoihoe lava. And it flows slowly and forms these ripples like this. You can imagine it pushing and then solidifying as it cools. And then you have this lava, which is very sharp and crinkly, and it flows more quickly. And then many of the cones themselves are actually made of ash. So this is tephra ash, so the ash that comes out of the volcano, with actually some lava sort of stuck into the tephra. And you'll often see that on the sides of the cliff sides of the islands. So they're volcanic islands, and at one point they didn't reach above the surface of the sea, and as soon as they did, they became potential habitat for wildlife. And you can imagine things getting there, and that's the story of the Galapagos, is how do things get to the Galapagos? Things that are more mobile, species that are more mobile, get there sooner and better, more frequently than things that are less mobile. It's a long way, 600 nautical miles over inhospitable ocean with no water to drink. But so lava is everything, and in fact it's a bit of a joke when you're there, but everything is lava this, lava that. This is the lava cactus. And then you have lava gulls. That's an endemic. Beautiful. I didn't notice that, but I think maybe we can, let's see if I can change the focus on that a little bit. Oh, look at that. That's not right. Ah, that's better. There we go. Sorry about that. I should have checked that. The lava gull and the lava lizard. That's about all I remember. That's the only small lizard on the island, so you can't go wrong. It's a lava lizard. So I'm going to talk about some reptiles, mammals, and birds, but I just wanted to mention these three terms. Native. A species is native to the Galapagos. It might be endemic to the Galapagos, or it might be introduced. Now, if you think about it, everything was introduced at one point because it was new land. But we have this funny sort of, if we introduce things, it's not natural. But if a seed gets introduced by a bird that's stuck to the bird's breast and gets dropped or is pooped out, then that's okay. That introduction is okay, but not when we do it. I won't say any more about that. But there's a lot of work today to stop humans from introducing species into the Galapagos Islands through all those controls I mentioned at the airport and all the procedures on board the ships in particular, vacuuming your pockets and making sure everything is very clean. So there are native species in the Galapagos, some of which are endemic, meaning they don't occur anywhere else in the world. And then there's a lot of introduced species that have come a lot later, usually by human intervention. So cats, rats, pigs, goats. Early days, people needed to eat, so they introduced farm animals. The goats are a disaster, by the way. The pigs are also a disaster. And there's active culling programs to get rid of them. But endemism is super common in the Galapagos Islands because it's so remote. When a species gets there, it's unlikely it's ever going to leave. And once it gets there, it evolves. And that basically is a nutshell of what Darwin observed and incorporated into his Origin of Species. And I'll talk about these three groups mainly. So, I won't be talking about insects, plants, because that's a whole other thing. The marine world is super interesting around the Galapagos Islands. Can't get into that. I'll just focus on these three groups. And of course, you have to start with the Galapagos giant tortoise. So that gives you sort of a scene of them. They're actually quite sensitive. They're sensitive to stepping, like they feel the vibrations. So when you're walking towards them, you go really slowly, trying not to stamp, and then they won't get scared. And they're huge. The males are bigger than the females. The young ones are smaller than the older ones, but nevertheless they're huge. They're the size of a little bit smaller than a VW Beetle, something like that. The biggest ones are. Pretty amazing. They love wetter climates. Remember I said they're isolated on those volcanoes in Isabella Island because it's too dry down below where they'd have to go to get to the next volcano. So they stay up in the moister areas where they have the lusher vegetation because that's what they eat basically. They eat all these grasses and vegetation that you can see. Driving out on Santa Cruz Island, you'll often have to stop to as they cross the road. That's a male and a female right there. I think he's got intentions, by the way, that male. And then you can see them up along the road there. There's two right here as well.
Look like ATVs or something.
Yeah. They're really fantastic. And this isn't the same couple, but that's what it looks like. They're incredible.
How much do they weigh, sir?
That's a good question.
when
I never looked that up, darn it. I tried to look up things that I thought, somebody's gonna ask that, and I forgot. We'll find out. They're heavy. There's several, up to 13, I think, different subspecies of giant tortoises. Some taxonomists have considered them full species, and maybe one day they will be considered species. But right now it's all one species with these very distinct subspecies living on different islands, and like I said, in Isla Isabella's case, different volcanoes on that island.
Ooh.
Yeah, they're incredible. And they're very long-lived, of course. They're 100 years plus. So, another important reptile on the island is the land iguana on the islands. And each island has its own version of land iguana. Some are paler than the others. Again, they're subspecies. All these would have come from the mainland at some point. So remember, the center of biodiversity nearest the Galapagos is South America, and what a center of biodiversity it is. So in that sense, the Galapagos are well positioned as a source of species getting out there. How these guys got out there, who knows? It's subject to conjecture, but they're big animals. So a big land iguana with its tail would be the length of this table.
Just the tail.
Well, the tail and the body and the head. So the whole, yeah. And they love opuntia cactus, so they don't care. They don't seem to mind the spines at all, but they really love opuntia. And I like this one because it actually shows a very interesting Galapagos fly here that I never did identify. But there are lots of endemic species of insects there. Pardon?
How close were you?
That's with a telephoto lens,
Oh.
quite a distance away, and then zoomed in. Generally, the guidelines are 2 to 3 meter distance from any wildlife. The wildlife basically doesn't know you're there because there's no natural predators. No land predators, no land mammals. There are some rice rats that are there that are considered now native, and of course the bats got there too. So there are bats, but there's no land mammals in the sense of foxes, skunks, and predatory species like that. And then a relatively closely related species is the famous marine iguana, and I say relatively closely related because they actually do interbreed. There are cases of hybrids between the land iguana and the marine iguana. And these are unique in the reptile world. They're iguanas, lizards basically, but iguanas that live in the sea. They're cold-blooded, in quotes, and the sea is relatively cold, so they can only stay in the sea for a certain length of time before they have to come out and sun in the equatorial sun, so it's nice and warm at least. And they eat basically algae, so they scrape the algae off the rocks, and that's how they make their living. They take a lot of salt in when they do that, so when they're on land, they have salt glands like seabirds do up here in the skull, and they're snorting out a highly saline solution from the salt glands quite regularly, but it's hard to get a picture of it. So marine iguanas, they're really, really incredible. They do a lot of sunning to warm up before they go in the water to feed. And on one of the islands, I'll have to just check the map. It's the one to the south and to the east. It's this subspecies that is red and green, so it's a really interesting subspecies.
The other ones are mostly dark.
More dark brown, yeah. And for some reason, this one has evolved the coloration. Often you'll see the young ones. These are young ones, just sticking to the sides of the tephra cliffs on the island, just sunning themselves, staying warm, waiting to go back into the cold ocean. And just to round out the reptiles, of course, the lava lizard again. They're really cute. They're maybe 10, 15 centimeters long, so not so big. Mammals. So, like I said, no real land mammals in that sense. There's a couple of rice rats I talked about. There's some introduced species, but mainly the land mammals are, the mammals that come on land are marine. And they're either sea lions, Galapagos sea lions, or Galapagos fur seals. And these big males, you can tell it's a male because of the forehead that comes up like this. The females have a sort of a slanting forehead, and they're huge. They're huge and aggressive because they hold harems. So they have lots of females, and they're the boss on a beach. They're the beach masters. You may have heard that term. And when they're on land, they're formidable. You give them a good wide berth. And the females are a lot smaller, softer, and this one was, this little young one was suckling with the mother there. The mums tend to be that color generally, and the weaners are fairly dark like that. And then you don't see fur seals too often, but this is the Galapagos fur seal. You can see it looks quite different looking head, but they both are eared seals. So there's no true seals in the Galapagos. But you can see much more a luxuriant fur coat on the fur seal than the Galapagos sea lion. Okay, so that's all I'll say about mammals. Going quickly. Oh boy, time is going fast. I'm still okay, I think. Am I okay for time? Good. I didn't even wait for an answer. Okay, now we're on to birds. So I thought, how am I going to organize the birds? And I thought, well, I'll do seabirds first. So seabirds, because they're obviously mobile, they're flying, particularly species like albatross, petrels, those sorts of species. It's nothing for them to fly 1,000 kilometers. So even in a day or two, they do feeding trips that long. So, that's why there's quite a few seabirds in the Galapagos Islands, including the waved albatross. The waved albatross is one of only four or five species of albatross that occur in the Pacific, in the North Pacific. So you've got three in particular that occur in the North Pacific, Japan, Alaska, and that area. Midway Island, Hawaii. That's the Laysan albatross, and you have the black-footed albatross and the short-tailed albatross. So some albatrosses do occur in the northern hemisphere. They're superb albatrosses. I mean, and their mating dance is incredible. Huge birds, and the chicks are pretty cute as well. I think.
Bad hair day.
Yeah. They're actually related to the northern Pacific albatrosses. They're endemic to Galapagos, but they have started to breed on, there's some interesting islands, volcanic islands, closer to the coast of Mexico and Colombia. One's called the Cocos Island, that actually has a Darwin finch nesting on. It's the Cocos finch, but it's in the Darwin finch family. By the way, they're tanagers, not our tanagers. They're tropical tanagers, Thropidae. Anyway, so that's the waved albatross. Then you have this amazing flightless cormorant. It's the biggest cormorant in the world, and it's allowed to be, its evolution has allowed its body size to increase because it doesn't need to fly anymore, in the air at least. So it's got these pitiful little wings, and it, like all cormorants and shags, it uses its feet to swim underwater, so it doesn't need its wings really for anything.
Nice.
Beautiful eye, and just a great bird. Big, chunky cormorant. The cormorants only occur in the western part of Galapagos, by the way, so in the newer islands, Fernandina and Isabella. Same with the penguin. If the Galapagos wasn't strange enough, it's even got a penguin, and you probably knew that. but they're amazing. They're the smallest of this group of penguins. The other ones being the Magellanic, the Humboldt, and the South African or black-footed penguin. So those form a genus. They're all in the same genus. This is the smallest one. Endangered, as is the waved albatross, for different reasons. In this case, the Galapagos penguin is hugely impacted by El Nino La Nina cycles, and every time there's a strong El Nino, the population crashes. There's just no food for them. This is kind of neat. I like this because you've got penguin on the equator with a fur seal or a sea lion, 2 sea lions, and a marine iguana next to each other. One of the most iconic species of seabird in the Galapagos is the blue-footed booby, of course. There's several species of boobies in the Galapagos. Booby, by the way, probably comes from the word in Spanish, booby, which means a fool. And many tropical seabirds are very tame. And over the years, many of them, the one I worked on for many years, the brown noddy, is a booby because it doesn't run away. You can just, so they were killed and eaten, of course, because they didn't fly away. They were just totally tame. But anyway, the blue-footed booby, of course, uses its feet to show off and to the female, and during the courting displays. So it's an ornament, and you can tell the sexes. The female has a bigger pupil than the male.
Oh, come on.
So that's kind of convenient. Yeah, but very gannet-like, right? I think you'd admit that because they are in the same family in the Sulidae, and they're tropical gannets, basically. Another booby that is much rarer in the Galapagos, but you have to go to the right places to see it, is the red-footed booby. It occurs in 2 morphs, the brown morph and a white morph. You can see the red feet there, but it's a spectacular booby. I mean, it really is amazing in breeding plumage and these brilliant red feet. Of course, the feet are really, in boobies, feet is everything. So they use the feet to signal. And then you have this really beautiful, what you might think is a masked booby, but in fact is a separate species in the Galapagos called the Nazca booby. It was separated off from the masked booby a while ago. And they're superb. So boobies. And then of course you have frigate birds. You've actually got 2 species. This is the great frigate bird, and you've also got the magnificent frigate bird. They're kind of hard to tell, but you mainly look at the sheen on the feathers. There's a chick right behind there, and this is a male that they take about half an hour to pump up this air sac in the front of their body, and it's a signaling display to females like, hey,
I'm here.
I'm here for you.
Oh, nice.
Gulls are one of my loves, and the swallowtail gull is incredible. They do get around. They're native and more or less endemic, but they do nest on a few other islands, like Cocos Island, for example. And there's one in the U.S. right now, so the gull people go crazy when they see it. They are a nocturnal gull, so they are at the colony during the day, and they fly off at night to feed on lanternfish and squid and various things that come to the surface at night. And they've got these gigantic eyes for nocturnal vision. Swallowtail gull. And then another endemic gull there, you've seen this already, is the lava gull, but I wanted to show you just a close-up of the this is gray down here, even though it looks white. In fact, it's gray, but a much darker gray on the head. Okay, now we've got some other land birds I wanted to talk about a little bit. This is the Galapagos dove, so it's also endemic, of course. And I think when I adjusted that, there we go. I'm going to make that, there we go, that's maybe a little bit better. At least the focus is good. Just a beautiful dove. And
See, but
there's,
that iridescent color on the neck.
oh
there.
yeah, similar actually to our mourning dove, has a little bit of a sheen on the neck.
Yeah.
But the face and the blue around the eye is just spectacular. And there is a single hawk down there. So there's not many predatory birds, but there is one. It's the Galapagos hawk. And genetic studies show that this almost certainly evolved from Swainson's hawk, which does occur in South America. Just got over there, isolated, and stayed. There's also a subspecies of the short-eared owl that looks really different to ours.
Yeah,
A lot
much
darker.
darker,
And this guy wasn't too happy that we woken him up, I don't think. And then there's an endemic flycatcher, the Galapagos flycatcher. You don't have to remember many names here. There's Galapagos this and Galapagos that. Just a beautiful little flycatcher. And if you think about it as well, it's pretty well sort of a random, you know, whatever got over there, it's almost the luck of the draw. So, you know, a yellow warbler got over there. Well, obviously two, maybe more than two, set up home, and now they've evolved into at least a separate subspecies, if not its own species. You can see the difference. You can see that chestnut-colored crown is very different to ours. But nevertheless, it's a real, normal, run-of-the-mill yellow warbler that got over there and decided it liked what it saw and stayed.
Do they not migrate at all then?
No,
No.
no. The land birds stay. The seabirds do leave and go, of course, out to the ocean during the non-breeding season, but the land birds stay. Yeah. Sometimes just on one island. Now, I mentioned the Darwin did get the mockingbirds pretty well sorted out. It was only 3 species after all. Well, 4, sorry, because one is almost extinct. But here you have the 3 mockingbirds that I've been lucky enough to see. The one that occurs on many islands is the Galapagos mockingbird. And then you have, up here you've got the Espanola mockingbird. And then this one is the San Cristobal mockingbird. And they all look a little different. Particularly, I find the Espanola one. The bill is huge.
Yeah.
And they're super tame. It's so neat. You just sit in the sand on the beach and they just run right around you. No fear at all. Run over your feet. It's just incredible. So they're really different. That one in particular is quite different. And there is, I put it in red here, but there is a Floriana mockingbird, which is just now only found on an island off Floriana. It's not found on Floriana itself anymore, and it's had some trouble, so it's not doing well. So I'm now going to get to the final group, and it's kind of like the best. It's the most fun group, I think, if you're a birder. And it took me all of the 4 visits to figure out Darwin's finches. But why am I showing you a dull-colored grassquit? Because this bird lives here in South America, all the way from Colombia down coast of Ecuador into Peru, etc., etc. It is genetically the most closely related to the Darwin's finches of any bird in South America, and is considered to be basically the parent species for all the 18 plus or minus species of Darwin finches that are now out on the islands. So it's interesting. This one guy, well, 2 of them got over there, and superficially they do look like Darwin's finches. But Darwin's finches have gone crazy. They've radiated to all the different conditions on the different islands, and this is what Darwin really didn't see. He saw it, but he didn't really understand it, and it took other people to figure that out. So they have radiated into all these different, mainly the bills are the focus. Now body size is different in all of them too. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but notice the the bill size in this warbler finch over here, for example, here compared to the large ground finch here, all related to conditions on a particular island that it is that they are found on. And this is what Peter Grant and his wife worked on, Rosemary worked on for all those years, to actually see the evolution of these species. They actually observed dry and wet periods and saw bill size change in an evolutionary way. They could relate the morphological change to genetic change. It's a fascinating study. So, just a few Darwin's finches, all the variety. There's the cactus finch, just a great Darwin's finch. This is the male. Males tend to be dark, females tend to be lighter gray in all the Darwin's finches, and it's adapted to the Opuntia cactus mainly. And then you have, this is the female, showing you a female. This is the large ground finch. This is the biggest of the Darwin's finches, a real honking bill, and arguably even bigger on the in the male, you know, and a bill adapted to breaking really tough seeds, really getting into the meaty part of a seed inside. And contrast that, this is a Darwin's finch.
Oh, wow.
That's the green warbler finch. Can you believe it? And I wanted to just do this.
Yeah,
Look at that.
that's incredible.
Can you believe that they all basically came from that one grassquit species that got over there? I was lucky enough to see the vegetarian finch once. I looked for the woodpecker finch. That's the one that uses sticks to get into holes and pull out insects and things. Didn't see it, but I was lucky enough. Just a fantastic Darwin's finch. Quite big, quite hard to see. There's two species of Darwin's finches that have taken endemism to the ultimate endpoint or degree. There's the Genovesa ground finch, and it gives it away what I'm going to talk about here, and the Genovesa cactus finch that literally only are found in the whole world on the island of Genovesa, or Tower Island, right there. Incredible. And then I thought for the last slide, it kind of, for me, it was a great experience to see this, but it also gives you an aspect of the Galapagos that I haven't talked about. And that is that certain migratory birds do visit the Galapagos and spend the winter time there. And you can imagine what they might be.
Oh.
It's a whimbrel. So that's an Alaskan whimbrel, probably, because that's the flyway that would come down to the Galapagos. But there's a Galapagos giant tortoise in behind,
Yeah.
and one of our very familiar birds in front. And of course, this is normal. Hey, I'm in the Galapagos for the wintertime. Fine, no problem. You see turnstones. I've seen Franklin's gulls there. You do see quite a few migratory birds that get out that far and spend the wintertime there. I've taken up way too much time, but thank you for your attention. Thank you. Have we got a few minutes for questions?
That would be great. Yeah, I'm sure
if
there
you
might
have
be a
any.
few questions about all this material.
Yeah,
But,
I'd highly recommend going if you can afford it. It's a little bit expensive. I'm very glad that I went virtually for free on the first time and worked there and got paid to go on the last 3 trips, so it's kind of neat.
I wonder, like a temporary foreign worker, a permit or something?
No, now that's an interesting point though. I couldn't work technically, so I was a guest. I was working for the parent company who owned a quarter of the ship I was on, but basically I entered as a private guest. Yeah. Good point though, yeah.
Does all food and water need to be imported there?
There are some water supplies now. They've found some fresh water on some of the islands. And all the food, yes, basically if you go outside of the main town of Puerto Ayora, and there's another one on San Cristobal Island, it's a little bit smaller, you will find local farmers growing tropical fruits, bananas and papayas and things like that. So there's a little bit of market produce on the island. I'm a coffee fanatic, so there's coffee plantations on the Galapagos. That was kind of neat. There's sugarcane plantations in some places, mainly on Santa Cruz Island. But yeah, almost everything has to come over by ship and essentially by flying cargo.
Does the introduction of those species of like commercial crops, does that have any spill off into?
It might. I would. There's a very strict agricultural inspection that goes on, as you can imagine. So nothing gets in there. I mean, if you take it's virtually hanging a fence if you take an apple to the Galapagos Island, for example, even though they don't grow them there. They're super strict in the airport. Any food product like that is, you're in big trouble if it's in your suitcase. So there's a very strict control, but I'm sure things probably get through. Yeah. And introduced species there's 1,500 introduced species of various sorts on the islands right now that they're working to try to get rid of, yeah. Wasps have come over, you can imagine, in fruit or something like that. Various fly species, parasitic flies, nest parasites. There's a fly that lives in nests and doesn't have any wings, and it's like a tick, but it's actually a fly, and it's responsible for one of the Darwin finches being almost extinct. So it is having an effect. Yeah.
Are there cats and dogs?
Yeah, mainly cats. The dogs, I'm not sure whether you're allowed to own them or not, cats in the towns. But there are wild feral cats, of course, and there's eradication programs in place for them, but they're pretty wily, right? They're easy. They're not easy to catch. Yeah, goats, like I said, is a big problem. Pigs are a big problem as well, but they're working on them.
Is there a regular time cycle for the Niño-Niña shift?
Yeah, that's a good question, Wendy. There is a wet and dry season that is superimposed over the La Nina and El Nino. So if you get an El Nino, which means rain, at the same time it's the rainy season, then it can be kind of combined into a bigger effect than it would normally. But it's normally, I mean, I haven't really studied it that much, but I remember we had an El Nino last year, and that's what gave us a pretty mild winter, if you remember. We're into La Nina conditions this year, so it's switched. So I would say every few years, every 2 or 3 years or more, but sometimes an El Nino lasts for a long time as well. You might have a 5-year El Nino where you're in those conditions for whatever reason for that long. Yeah. So I don't think it's very regular.
So we can't even predict.
Yeah, they do try to predict it. They monitor it, and in fact, NOAA does a lot of that. I hope they still continue to. I follow NOAA quite a bit on Facebook, and so far they're posting a lot of good stuff still on climate change and things. But maybe his
I thought
nibs hasn't got
his
to them
nibs
yet.
was going to.
Yeah, I mean,
Shocking.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but they monitor it because it has such huge implications for global weather, basically. And certainly North America. So NOAA monitors, and you could go onto their site, and if you Google El Nino conditions, NOAA, it'll give you the forecast for the next 3 months, where we're at, whether we're in La Nina or El Nino, and they'll give you maps of the sea surface temperatures and all the oceanography you need to understand it. Yeah. Good.
That
Yeah.
last bird that had the heavy bill that was sitting on the ground there, one of the biggest ones of all.
Yeah.
What size would that be? Like a crow or a raven or what?
Good question. So the biggest Darwin's finch is about that long. So it's about the same length as a robin maybe,
Mhm.
but very chunky
Yeah,
and this huge oversized bill.
very strong. in
Yeah,
that way.
yeah, for these super hard seeds that could be laying dry for years
Mhm.
between wet seasons, right? Between El Ninos, the seeds could lay on the ground and they're just hard as rocks.
Yeah.
You know, you need a rock to crush it,
Mhm.
but these guys can do it. Yeah, and when that's actually what Grant actually monitored, because on in dry seasons, when you have quite a few dry seasons in a row, you get the evolutionary change favors particular subspecies or species with bigger bills.
Mhm.
And so the smaller bill birds drop away and you lose the genetic information coding for those smaller bills, and so you get an evolutionary change driven by basically rain conditions, driven through the seeds. Yeah, really, there's more to it than that. But.
So how do the warbler finches survive these?
Yeah, so they feed in the wet areas, so they're up in the cloudy.
So they're restricted to the.
Yeah.
And
they
those
feed-
wet areas will stay wet through.
Yeah, they do.
Through,
Same with that's where the
Tortoises.
tortoises are as
Yeah.
well. So they stay wet, damp, even in a La Nina they'll stay wet because you get the moist air, and they're up on the volcanoes at some altitude. So you get the precipitation, cloudy.
The moist air from the ocean comes, hits an orographic lift, and you get. the-
Exactly. Yeah. So those are permanently damp areas,
Yeah.
lush green areas, and the warbler finches love it. There, yeah. Yeah. But when you go first, a warning: if you do go, the Darwin's finches are completely. I mean, I didn't know what I was looking at.
Yeah.
Because you've got tree finches, then you've got ground finches, you've got large, medium, and small tree finch,
Yes.
you've got large, medium, and small ground finch. Then you've got all the real neat ones like
Yeah.
the woodpecker finch and the vegetarian finch and whatever. There's even one that feeds on blood, so it pecks. Yeah, it's the one that's not doing well out on the west coast. It's like a vampire finch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's quite the spread of
Yeah.
evolutionary species.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a pleasure talking about Galapagos, and I have to go, even though I've been quite a few times, I really would like to go back.